A morning of heavy clouds. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the Dawson family's modest suburban home, illuminating the quiet hum of morning routines. Officer Matthew Dawson stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into his travel mug. His uniform was crisp, the badge on his chest gleaming, a symbol of authority and protection. Despite his composed demeanor, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had followed him since waking. He glanced at his 10-year-old daughter, Emily, who sat at the dining table, mechanically poking her cereal with a spoon. "Emily," Matthew said gently, setting down his mug, "you've barely touched your breakfast. Is something wrong?" Emily shrugged, her eyes glued to the swirls in her bowl. "I'm not hungry," she mumbled. Her mother, Sarah, stepped into the kitchen, tying her long auburn hair into a ponytail. She placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder and nodded toward Emily, a silent plea for him to probe further. "Sweetheart," Matthew tried again, his tone softening, "you've been quiet all week. Did something happen at school?" Emily hesitated, her small fingers tightening around the spoon. Finally, she whispered, "I don't want to go today." Matthew's brow furrowed as he pulled out a chair and sat next to her. "Why not? Is someone bothering you?" Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "It's just Maddie and Zoe. They don't like me. They said I'm weird because I don't have a phone like everyone else. And yesterday," her voice broke, and she looked down, "they said I should just stop coming to school." Matthew felt a sharp pang of guilt. As a police officer, he had dealt with countless bullying cases, always emphasizing the importance of speaking up. But hearing his own daughter's anguish was an entirely different kind of heartbreak. Sarah knelt beside Emily, wrapping her in a comforting hug. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. You don't deserve that." Emily's quiet sniffles filled the room. Matthew's jaw tightened as a mix of anger and helplessness surged through him. He reached out to hold her hand. "Emily, listen to me. You're not weird, and you have every right to be at that school. Maddie and Zoe are wrong." Emily looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with doubt. "But what if they don't stop?" "They won't stop unless you stand up for yourself," Matthew said firmly. "I know it's hard, but you're strong, and I'll make sure the school knows what's going on." Sarah shot him a concerned glance but said nothing. Matthew's determination was palpable, though she worried about how Emily would handle the confrontation. "Okay," Emily murmured, her voice barely audible. Matthew gave her a reassuring smile. "Good. Now finish your breakfast, and we'll head out." As the family prepared to leave, Sarah pulled Matthew aside. "Be careful with how much you push her," she said in a hushed tone. "She's just a kid." "I know," Matthew replied, his voice laced with frustration. "But she needs to know how to handle these situations. The world won't always be kind." Sarah sighed, her worry deepening. "Just don't forget that she's looking to you for more than just advice. She needs to feel safe." Matthew nodded, though he couldn't shake the conviction that teaching Emily resilience was the best way to protect her. He kissed Sarah on the cheek before heading out the door, Emily trailing behind him. The drive to school was silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. Matthew stole glances at Emily in the rearview mirror, her small frame hunched as she stared out the window. He wanted to say something to ease her worries but couldn't find the right words. When they arrived at the school, Emily hesitated before unbuckling her seatbelt. "Do you think they'll leave me alone?" she asked quietly. "They will if you show them you're not afraid," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "And if they don't, I'll be here to back you up." Emily nodded, though her expression betrayed her lingering fear. She stepped out of the car, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and walked toward the school entrance. Matthew watched her go, a knot tightening in his stomach. As she disappeared into the building, he muttered under his breath, "You'll be okay, kiddo." Matthew's patrol car glided through the quiet streets, the morning sunlight casting long shadows. The routine of his shift, checking meters, scanning for traffic violations, provided little distraction from his thoughts about Emily. He replayed their conversation, questioning whether he had done enough to prepare her for the challenges she faced. His radio crackled, pulling him from his reverie. Unit 27, we have a report of a speeding vehicle heading westbound on Main Street. Please respond. Matthew grabbed the radio. Copy that. On my way. Flipping on the siren, he sped toward the reported location. Within minutes, he spotted the vehicle, a silver minivan racing down the road. It lacked emergency lights or sirens, yet the urgency of its driver was evident. Matthew signaled for the vehicle to pull over, and it complied, veering to the side of the road. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holster out of habit. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a woman in scrubs with disheveled hair and a panicked expression. "Officer, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I have a child in the car who needs immediate medical attention." Matthew's eyes darted to the passenger seat, where a small figure was wrapped in an emergency blanket. The sight of the unconscious child made his stomach churn, but something else caught his attention. A glimpse of dark brown curls that looked unsettlingly familiar. "Why isn't he in an ambulance?" Matthew asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. The nurse fumbled for words, her anxiety palpable. "There weren't any ambulances available. I work at the hospital. And I didn't have a choice." Matthew stepped closer, his pulse quickening as he examined the child. His heart skipped a beat when the blanket shifted slightly, revealing a face he knew all too well. It was Emily. Time seemed to freeze as Matthew's mind struggled to process the scene before him. His daughter, who should have been safely at school, was unconscious and in need of urgent medical care. The world tilted on its axis, and a single question echoed in his mind. How had this happened? The fractured mirror. Matthew's hands trembled as he stepped back from the minivan, his mind racing in every direction, but finding no answers. Emily's pale, unconscious face haunted him. The lively spark she carried extinguished in an instant. His training fought to take over, to remain calm, to focus. But the father in him, the protector, screamed louder. "Follow me," he barked to the nurse. His voice was commanding, but the urgency betrayed his unraveling composure. Without waiting for a response, he sprinted to his patrol car, the siren wailing as he cleared the road for the minivan. Inside the minivan, Nurse Alyssa Morgan stole a glance at the child beside her. She didn't know the officer personally, but his reaction told her everything. This child wasn't just a random patient. She gritted her teeth, clutching the wheel tighter as she floored the gas pedal to keep up. The hospital loomed ahead, a beacon of hope and dread. Matthew's car skidded to a halt outside the emergency entrance, the minivan pulling up seconds later. He leaped out, flinging open the minivan door, his voice bellowing, "We need help here now." Doctors and nurses rushed forward, a stretcher materializing like clockwork. Matthew's pulse thudded in his ears as he watched Emily's limp body being transferred. One of the nurses called out her vitals, each word slicing through his heart like a blade. Severe dehydration. Possible internal trauma. Oxygen saturation dropping. Alyssa stepped forward, trying to offer comfort. "Officer Dawson, she's in good hands now. Let the team." "How did this happen?" Matthew snapped, his voice a raw edge. His eyes bored into hers, demanding answers. I don't know the full story," Alyssa admitted, her composure faltering. "I was driving back from my shift when I saw her lying on the sidewalk near the school. She wasn't moving. There were no teachers or staff around, and her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. I couldn't wait for an ambulance. I knew time was critical." Matthew's jaw tightened, his instincts kicking in. "The school," he repeated, his voice low and menacing. His mind reeled as he pieced together fragments. Emily's reluctance that morning, the bully she had mentioned, and now this. The pieces formed a sinister mosaic. "I need to know everything," Matthew demanded. "Who left her there? Why wasn't she in class? What?" "Officer," interrupted a doctor in scrubs, emerging from the flurry of activity near the emergency bay. We've stabilized your daughter for now. She's severely dehydrated, has multiple contusions, and there's evidence of a significant fall. We need imaging to rule out internal injuries. She's being prepped for a CT scan. Can I see her? Matthew asked, his voice trembling. The doctor hesitated. Not yet. We need to act quickly. You'll be able to see her soon, but right now, our priority is her care. Matthew nodded numbly, his eyes fixed on the doors that had swallowed Emily. He felt Sarah's absence acutely. She deserved to be here, to know what was happening. His hands fumbled for his phone, but he froze mid-dial as a wave of emotion overtook him. He leaned against the wall, his breathing ragged. I should have listened to her, he muttered under his breath. I should have known. Alyssa stayed by his side, unsure whether to offer comfort or silence. Finally, she spoke. Officer, I don't know what you're feeling right now, but if I hadn't found her. She paused, her voice tight with emotion. Just know that she's a fighter. She was trying to say something when I picked her up. Dad, she fought to stay conscious for you. Matthew clenched his fists, tears brimming in his eyes. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Thank you for what you did. Truly, I'll never forget it. He looked toward the emergency room doors again. Then, as if struck by lightning, his expression hardened. I need to go to the school. Alyssa blinked. What? Officer, you should stay. She wouldn't be here if they'd been doing their job. Matthew interrupted. Someone is going to answer for this. The drive to the school felt surreal, the road ahead a blur as Matthew's mind replayed Emily's broken body on that stretcher. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, fury and guilt clawing at his chest. When he arrived, the playground was empty, save for a few scattered wrappers and a solitary swing creaking in the breeze. The emptiness only fueled his rage. Marching inside, he approached the front desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up and smiled. Good afternoon. Can I help? Where's the principal? Matthew's voice was steel. The woman faltered. Mr. Handley is in a meeting. Can I? I'm Officer Dawson, and this is about my daughter, Emily. Matthew cut her off. If he's not out here in 2 minutes, I'll find him myself. The receptionist paled, picking up the phone with trembling hands. Moments later, the principal, a short man with a receding hairline, emerged, his brow furrowed in confusion. Officer Dawson, he greeted, extending a hand. What seems to be the... Matthew ignored the gesture, stepping closer. My daughter is in the hospital. Unconscious. Dehydrated. Bruised. She was left outside your school on the sidewalk. Explain that to me. The color drained from Handley's face. Emily. She's in the hospital. I wasn't informed. You weren't informed. Matthew's voice rose. You're the principal. You're supposed to know everything that happens here. Handley stammered. Let me check the records. We can. Records? Matthew growled. She's not a number. She's a child. A child you failed to protect. The tension in the office was suffocating as Handley fumbled to pull up the day's logs. Matthew's eyes scanned the room, taking in the plaques on the wall, the inspirational quotes, the smiling photos of students, all mocking in the face of his daughter's suffering. Finally, Handley spoke, his voice shaky. It says Emily was marked absent for most of the day. There's no record of her attending class after the first period. Matthew's blood ran cold, so no one thought to check on her, to find out where she was. Handley hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. The attendance system isn't perfect. Teachers are supposed to notify us if... Stop. Matthew's voice was ice. This isn't about systems. This is about my daughter lying unconscious while you're sitting here with your policies and protocols. What about the bullies she mentioned? Maddie and Zoe. Handley shifted uncomfortably. I have received complaints about them before, but their parents are significant donors to the school. We've tried addressing it without escalating. Matthew slammed his hand on the desk, making Handley flinch. You ignored it because it was inconvenient. Well, now it's a crime scene. Before Hanley could respond, Matthew turned on his heel, heading for the playground. The receptionist's wide eyes followed him, but no one dared to stop him. The cool air outside did little to calm his fury as he scanned the area. His eyes landed on a patch of disturbed dirt near the swing set. He approached it, crouching down to inspect. There were faint impressions of small shoes, the dirt scuffed as if someone had fallen or been pushed. Matthew's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone, dialing his partner at the station. "Brad, I need you to send a team to Harmony Elementary. We've got evidence of a possible assault. And get a search warrant for the school's security footage." As he stood, the weight of the situation pressed on his shoulders. Emily's small frame flashed in his mind, her trust in him to protect her. He swore to himself, this wasn't over. With his badge, his resolve, and his love for his daughter as his weapon, Matthew prepared for the fight ahead. Threads of truth. Matthew sat motionless in his patrol car, parked in the shadow of Harmony Elementary's aging brick facade. His knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as his mind replayed the fragments of the day. Emily's frail body on the stretcher, the nurse's hurried explanation, and the principal's stumbling excuses. Every piece felt jagged, wrong, and incomplete, like a puzzle missing its center. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He grabbed it, expecting an update from Sarah or the hospital, but it was a call from Brad, his partner at the station. "Matt." Brad's voice was calm but firm. "We've got the search warrant and pulled some of the school's security footage. It's not great." Matthew's grip tightened. "How bad?" Brad hesitated. "It's best if you come see for yourself. The footage raises more questions than answers." Matthew swallowed hard, torn between staying at the school to push for answers and heading back to the station to see the evidence firsthand. Finally, he muttered, "I'm on my way," and started the engine. The drive to the station was a blur of streetlights and simmering anger. The usually short trip felt endless, his thoughts swirling with every scenario of what might have happened to Emily. By the time he pulled into the lot, he was brimming with anticipation and dread. Inside, Brad was waiting in the small, dimly lit tech room, a monitor already displaying grainy footage. His face was grim as he gestured for Matthew to take a seat. "We started with footage from around the playground," Brad explained. "This is from earlier today, about an hour before the nurse found Emily." Matthew leaned in, his pulse quickening as the footage rolled. The camera angle showed the old disused playground, a shadowy area far from the main building. Two girls, Maddie and Zoe, appeared in the frame, dragging Emily by her arm. Emily resisted, trying to pull away, but the older girls were relentless. Matthew's fists clenched as he watched. Maddie pushed Emily, causing her to stumble onto the concrete steps. Zoe stood nearby, laughing, her hand pointing mockingly at Emily's torn skirt. "They're toying with her," Matthew muttered, his voice trembling with restrained fury. Brad nodded grimly. "It gets worse." The video continued. Maddie said something inaudible, but her body language was menacing. Emily hesitated before stepping onto the narrow ledge of a raised platform. The two bullies laughed, clapping mockingly. Emily tried to maintain her balance, but Maddie gave her a sudden shove. Emily fell, her body crumpling as she struck the jagged rock below. Matthew shot to his feet, his chair screeching backward. "They pushed her," he roared. "And then what? Did they just leave her there?" Brad held up a hand. "Keep watching." On the footage, Maddie and Zoe stood frozen for a moment, their laughter replaced by visible panic. Maddie grabbed Zoe's arm, and they both sprinted out of frame, leaving Emily lying motionless. Matthew's chest heaved, his breaths coming in short bursts. "They left her to die," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "They didn't even call for help." Brad nodded. "It's bad, Matt. But there's more." Brad clicked to another camera angle, this one showing the school's side entrance. About 10 minutes after Maddie and Zoe fled, The footage showed a teacher, Mr. Hanover, walking out of the building with a clipboard. He glanced toward the playground, his eyes lingering on Emily's prone figure. For a moment, it looked as though he might approach, but instead, he shook his head and walked back inside. Matthew's hands slammed onto the desk. He saw her and did nothing. Brad sighed. We're still trying to figure out why, but yes, it looks that way. Matthew paced the room, his mind a storm of rage and disbelief. This is negligence. No, it's worse. This is criminal. Those girls assaulted her, and that teacher abandoned her. Brad nodded, and we're going to hold them accountable. But we need to move carefully. The parents of those girls have powerful connections, and the school's already circling the wagons. We need airtight evidence. Matthew's eyes burned with fury. We have the footage. What more do we need? Brad leaned forward, his tone cautious. The footage shows what happened, but it doesn't capture their intent. Maddie and Zoe will claim it was an accident, that they didn't mean for her to fall. And the school will argue Mr. Hanover didn't realize the severity of the situation. We need more. Witnesses, statements, anything that makes this case impossible to dismiss. Matthew nodded, forcing himself to calm down. Fine, I'll get what we need. But I swear, Brad, if they try to brush this under the rug. They won't, Brad interrupted, his voice firm. Not with us on this. Matthew left the station with a newfound sense of purpose. The footage had given him a clearer picture, but it wasn't enough to ease the knot of guilt in his chest. He had to know why this had happened, and he had to make sure it never happened again. His first stop was Maddie's house. The upscale neighborhood was a stark contrast to the raw anger Matthew carried inside. He rang the doorbell, and a well-dressed woman answered, her perfectly coiffed hair and polished demeanor betraying no hint of worry. Officer Dawson, Matthew began, flashing his badge. I need to speak with your daughter, Maddie, about an incident at school. The woman's smile faltered. What kind of incident? Matthew's jaw tightened. An assault. On my daughter. Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to respond. But Matthew cut her off. I'm not here to debate this. Maddie needs to come with me for questioning. Now. Maddie appeared moments later, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She glanced nervously at her mother, who gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before addressing Matthew. Officer, my daughter is just a child. Surely we can handle this privately. This isn't a private matter, Matthew snapped. Your daughter's actions left my child in the hospital. She'll answer for them. Maddie flinched, tears pooling in her eyes. I didn't mean to push her that hard, she stammered. I swear, I didn't mean. Matthew's gaze bore into her. You left her there. Alone. Explain that. I didn't know what to do, Maddie sobbed. I panicked. Zoe said we'd get in trouble if we stayed. Matthew took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. Maddie, I'm going to ask you some questions at the station. Be honest, and it might help you. He led her to his car, ignoring her mother's protests. As he drove back to the station, he glanced at Maddie in the rearview mirror. Her tears didn't move him. What moved him was the thought of Emily, his sweet, trusting daughter, lying broken while her bullies ran away. Back at the station, Matthew prepared himself for the difficult road ahead. There were still questions to answer, evidence to gather, and justice to pursue. But for the first time since the day had begun, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wouldn't stop until the truth was laid bare, and Emily's pain was vindicated. The battle lines. Matthew sat in the dim interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows on the stark white walls. Across the table sat Maddie, her tear-streaked face turned downward, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. Beside her, a sharp-suited lawyer shuffled papers, while Maddie's mother sat stiffly, her carefully composed expression betraying the anxiety flickering in her eyes. Matthew leaned forward, his voice measured but firm. Maddie, I need you to tell me everything that happened today. From the moment you arrived at school to the moment you left the playground. The lawyer raised a hand, his voice cutting. Officer Dawson, let's not forget that Maddie is a minor. She's cooperating out of courtesy, not obligation. Any questioning will adhere strictly to legal protocols. Matthew's eyes flicked to the lawyer. Your client's actions put my daughter in the hospital. This is no courtesy. It's an investigation. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Maddie's mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, whispering something inaudible. Maddie hesitated, her lips trembling as she began to speak. I didn't mean to hurt her, Maddie stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just a game. A game. Matthew repeated, his tone sharpening. What kind of game leaves someone unconscious on the pavement? Maddie's lawyer interjected again. Officer Dawson, this line of questioning is... Matthew cut him off, his gaze locked on Maddie. Answer the question, Maddie. What were you and Zoe doing? Maddie shifted uncomfortably, tears pooling in her eyes. It was Zoe's idea. She said Emily needed to learn how to stand up for herself. We told her to walk across the ledge. We didn't think she'd fall. Matthew's fists clenched under the table, his anger barely contained. And after she fell, after she hit her head and couldn't get up, what did you do? Maddie's voice cracked. We panicked. Zoe said we should leave. She said if we stayed, we'd get blamed. So you left her there, Matthew said, his voice low and dangerous. Alone. Injured. Maddie broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, glaring at Matthew. That's enough. She's just a child. Matthew stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So does my daughter. The difference is that your child walked away. Mine didn't. Leaving the interrogation room, Matthew felt his composure slipping. His heart pounded as he paced the hallway, his mind replaying Maddie's confession. Her words echoed like a drumbeat. It was just a game. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Sarah's name on the screen. Sarah, he answered quickly, his voice tight with emotion. How's Emily? She's stable, Sarah said, her voice shaky. The doctor said the CT scan didn't show any brain damage, but she's still weak. They're keeping her under observation. Matthew exhaled, relief washing over him. Thank God. I'm coming back to the hospital as soon as I can. Matthew, Sarah said, her tone cautious. Did you find out what happened? Matthew hesitated, his throat tightening. It was Maddie and Zoe. They were bullying her, made her do something dangerous. And when she got hurt, they left her. Sarah was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with quiet fury. We trusted that school. We thought she was safe there. Matthew closed his eyes, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. I know. And I'm going to make sure this never happens again. When Matthew returned to the hospital, he found Sarah sitting by Emily's bedside, her hand gently brushing their daughter's hair. Emily's small frame seemed even more fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights, the IV line taped to her arm, a painful reminder of her vulnerability. Hey, kiddo, Matthew said softly, sitting on the other side of the bed. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her lips curving into a faint smile. Hi, Dad, she whispered, her voice weak. Matthew's throat tightened as he took her hand. You scared me today, Em, but you're going to be okay. I promise. Emily's smile faded, her brow furrowing. I tried to tell them I didn't want to, but they made me. They said I was too weak to do it. Matthew exchanged a glance with Sarah, his heart breaking at the pain in Emily's voice. You're not weak, Em. You're one of the strongest people I know. Emily's eyes welled with tears, but they didn't stop, even when I told them I was scared. Matthew leaned forward, his voice firm, but gentle. And they're going to answer for that. No one has the right to treat you like that, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. The next day, Matthew met with his partner, Brad, and the district attorney to discuss the case. The footage, Maddie's confession, and Emily's testimony painted a clear picture, but Matthew knew the battle wasn't over. "We've got enough to file charges against Maddie and Zoe," the district attorney said, adjusting his glasses, "but their families are already pushing back. They're claiming it was an accident." "An accident," Matthew said incredulously. "They pushed her. They left her there to die." The DA raised a hand. "I don't disagree, but their lawyers are spinning it as kids being reckless, not malicious. We need to show intent." Matthew's frustration boiled over. So what, they get a slap on the wrist because their parents can afford good lawyers? What about the school? The teacher who saw Emily and did nothing? Brad placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "We'll get them, Matt. But we need to build this case piece by piece." Over the next few days, Matthew threw himself into the investigation. He interviewed staff, combed through policies, and documented every failure that had led to Emily's injury. Each discovery fueled his determination to hold the school accountable. The school board called an emergency meeting, and Matthew was invited to present his findings. The room was packed with parents, teachers, and reporters, the air buzzing with tension. Matthew stood at the podium, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "My daughter, Emily, trusted this school to protect her. Instead, she was bullied, assaulted, and abandoned. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a systemic failure." He outlined the lack of supervision, the ignored complaints, and the administration's failure to act against known bullies. His words were met with murmurs of agreement and outrage. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. The school board promised immediate reforms, and the superintendent vowed to investigate the administration's handling of bullying cases. That night, Matthew returned to the hospital. Emily was asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Sarah looked up from her seat, exhaustion etched into her features. "You did good today," she said softly. "Emily would be proud." Matthew sat beside her, taking her hand. "I just want her to feel safe again." "She will," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Because she knows you'll always fight for her." As the room fell silent, Matthew looked at his daughter, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just about justice for Emily. It was about creating a world where no child had to endure what she had. And he wouldn't stop until that world became a reality. The reckoning. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as parents, reporters, and community members filed into the gallery. Matthew sat at the plaintiff's table, his uniform crisp and his expression resolute. On his left was Sarah, her hands tightly clasped together, her face a mixture of determination and anguish. Behind them, a group of parents sat in silent solidarity, their presence a testament to the growing outrage within the community. Across the aisle, Maddie and Zoe sat beside their parents, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys. Their polished appearance belied the gravity of the situation, as though their wealth and privilege could somehow shield them from accountability. The judge entered the room, and everyone rose. With a sharp rap of the gavel, the trial began. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of Emily's ordeal. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Amanda Trask, wasted no time in presenting the evidence. The security footage, Maddie's confession, and the testimony of school staff who had witnessed the bullying. These actions were not mere accidents, Amanda declared, her voice ringing through the courtroom. They were deliberate acts of malice, rooted in a culture of impunity fostered by this school and perpetuated by the defendants' families. Matthew watched as the words landed like blows, the weight of truth filling the room. He had seen countless trials in his career, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about justice. It was about redemption for his daughter and change for an entire system. The defense, however, was no less formidable. Maddie and Zoe's lawyers argued that the girls were too young to understand the consequences of their actions. They painted them as misguided children, caught up in a moment of poor judgment rather than malicious intent. "These are not criminals," the lead attorney said, his tone almost pleading. "They are children. Mistakes were made, yes, but they were born of immaturity, not malice. Matthew's jaw tightened as he listened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Mistakes, he thought bitterly. Leaving my daughter to die wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. When it was Matthew's turn to testify, he felt the weight of the room's gaze as he stood and approached the witness stand. Amanda guided him through the questioning, her voice steady and supportive. "Officer Dawson," she began, "can you describe the impact this incident has had on your family?" Matthew took a deep breath, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "It's turned our world upside down. My daughter Emily, she's bright, kind, and full of life. But now she's afraid to go back to school. She wakes up screaming from nightmares. She asks me if it was her fault." His voice cracked, and he paused to collect himself. No child should have to carry that burden, and no parent should have to explain why the people who hurt her might not face consequences. Amanda nodded, her expression empathetic. "Thank you, Officer Dawson." No further questions. The defense attorney rose, his polished demeanor carefully calibrated. "Officer Dawson," he began, his tone almost condescending, "do you believe Maddie and Zoe intended for your daughter to fall and injure herself?" Matthew's eyes narrowed. "I believe their actions led to her injury, and they chose to leave her there instead of helping. That's intent enough for me." The lawyer pressed on. "But isn't it possible they were simply scared, that their decision to leave was born of panic, not malice?" Matthew's voice hardened. "They laughed while she was on that ledge. They pushed her. They left her bleeding on the ground. Call it panic if you want, but those actions were deliberate." The trial dragged on for days, each argument and counterargument dissecting the events leading up to Emily. "Your actions were reckless, cruel, and caused significant harm to your classmate. You may not have intended for Emily to fall, but your choices after the fact, leaving her there, failing to seek help, speak volumes about your character." She turned to the school's attorney. "And this institution bears significant responsibility. The repeated failure to address bullying, the lack of oversight, and the negligence of staff have created an environment where such behavior is tolerated." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Maddie and Zoe were sentenced to mandatory counseling, community service, and restorative justice sessions with Emily and her family. The school was fined heavily and ordered to implement comprehensive reforms, including anti-bullying programs and stricter oversight. As the courtroom emptied, Matthew felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over him. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was a step forward, a message that actions had consequences, no matter who you were. Outside, reporters swarmed him, their questions a cacophony of noise. But Matthew ignored them, focusing instead on Sarah and Emily, who waited nearby. "You did it," Sarah said, her eyes glistening with pride and tears. "No," Matthew replied, his voice soft but resolute. "We did it. For her." Emily hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. Matthew held her close, his heart full. The battle wasn't over. There was still healing to do, still changes to fight for. But in that moment, surrounded by his family, he felt hope for the first time in a long time. And hope, he realized, was the most powerful victory of all. A brighter tomorrow. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, bathing the room in soft light. Emily sat upright in her hospital bed, her small hands fiddling with the corner of her blanket. Though her body still bore the marks of her ordeal, fading bruises, a bandage on her temple, her eyes had regained some of their familiar spark. Beside her, Sarah gently brushed Emily's hair, her voice low and soothing as they talked about plans for the future. Matthew stood near the window, his arms crossed as he looked out over the city. It had been weeks since the trial concluded, and while justice had been served, he felt the lingering weight of what had happened. He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind, questioning every decision, every moment he might have done something differently. "Dad," Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, He turned, his expression softening as he saw her looking at him with a curious tilt of her head. "What's up, kiddo?" he asked, walking over to sit at the edge of her bed. Emily hesitated, then looked down at her hands. "Do I have to go back to school?" The question hit Matthew harder than he expected. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement. He took a deep breath before answering. "Not until you're ready," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "And when you do, things will be different. I promise you that." Emily's lip quivered, but she managed a small smile. "Okay." Over the next few days, Matthew and Sarah worked tirelessly to prepare for Emily's return to normalcy. They met with the school board to discuss the new policies being implemented: an anonymous reporting system for bullying, increased staff supervision, and mandatory training on recognizing and addressing harassment. A team of counselors had been brought in to support students like Emily, and a restorative justice program was being developed to help rebuild trust among students. But even with these changes, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that more needed to be done. One evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, he sat at the dining table with Sarah, his laptop open, and a stack of notes beside him. "What are you working on?" Sarah asked, setting down 2 mugs of tea. Matthew rubbed his temples. "A proposal. I've been thinking about starting an initiative, something bigger than just our school." Sarah leaned closer, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of initiative?" "An anti-bullying program," Matthew said. "Not just for kids, but for parents, teachers, and administrators. Something that addresses the root causes, not just the symptoms. It would focus on empathy, accountability, and creating a culture where kids feel safe to speak up." Sarah smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That's an incredible idea." Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't know where to start. There's so much to do, and I'm not sure if anyone will listen." Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "They'll listen, Matthew. You've already made people listen. Look at what you've done for Emily and for the school. This is just the next step." With Sarah's encouragement, Matthew threw himself into the project. He reached out to colleagues, community leaders, and advocacy groups, gathering resources and support. He spent late nights drafting proposals, designing workshops, and planning events. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. The program, which he named Safe Steps, launched with a community event held at the local library. Parents, teachers, and students filled the room, eager to learn more about the initiative. Matthew stood at the front, his nerves settling as he saw the interest and hope on their faces. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "My name is Matthew Dawson, and I'm a police officer. But tonight, I'm here as a father who almost lost his daughter because of bullying." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This program isn't just about preventing bullying. It's about creating a culture where every child feels valued and safe. It's about giving parents and teachers the tools they need to recognize the signs and intervene before it's too late. And most importantly, it's about teaching our kids to stand up for themselves and for each other." The room erupted in applause, and Matthew felt a surge of hope. This was the beginning of something bigger than himself, bigger than his family, a movement that could change lives. As the weeks turned into months, Safe Steps gained traction. Schools across the district adopted the program, and Matthew was invited to speak at conferences and community events. His story resonated with parents and educators, sparking conversations about accountability and compassion. At home, Emily's recovery was slow but steady. With the help of therapy, she began to regain her confidence. She still had moments of fear and doubt, but her resilience shone through. One day, as she sat at the kitchen table drawing, she looked up at Matthew with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she asked, "can I help with your program?" Matthew raised an eyebrow, setting down his coffee mug. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" Emily grinned, holding up her drawing. It was a colorful poster with the words, "Be a friend," not a bully, written in bold letters. "Maybe you can use this," she said, "for one of your events." Matthew's heart swelled with pride. "That's perfect, Em. You're amazing." The following year, Matthew stood on stage at a regional education summit, presenting the success of Safe Steps to an audience of thousands. As he spoke about the program's impact, he spotted Emily and Sarah sitting in the front row, their smiles beaming with pride. When the presentation ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Matthew felt a lump in his throat as he stepped off the stage, pulling Emily and Sarah into a tight embrace. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You did it for me, Dad, and for everyone like me." Matthew nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. Together, they had turned pain into purpose, creating a brighter tomorrow for their community. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they had found something even more powerful: hope. A brighter tomorrow. The applause from the audience at the education summit still rang in Matthew's ears as he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. The sunlight painted the city in golden hues, and for the first time in months, he felt lighter. His mission was far from over, but the path ahead felt clearer now. Emily skipped alongside him, holding the colorful poster she had designed for the event. She had insisted on bringing it to the summit and beamed when the attendees admired her work. Sarah walked on Matthew's other side, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You were incredible up there," Sarah said, her voice filled with pride. "You're really making a difference, Matthew." Matthew nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at Emily. "It's all for her. For kids like her. No one should ever have to go through what she did." Emily tugged at his sleeve, her wide eyes shining. "Dad, do you think the bullies, Maddie and Zoe, will ever change?" Matthew knelt down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I hope so, sweetheart. Sometimes people make bad choices because they don't understand the pain they're causing. But if they're willing to learn and take responsibility, they can change." Emily thought for a moment, then nodded. "I hope they do. I don't want them to hurt anyone else." Her words stirred something deep within Matthew. Emily's ability to forgive, to hope for a better future even for those who had hurt her, was a reminder of the resilience and compassion he had fought to nurture in her. The months that followed brought even more milestones for the Dawson family. Emily returned to school, though not to Harmony Elementary. After careful consideration, Matthew and Sarah decided to enroll her in a different school that embraced the principles of inclusion and kindness. The transition wasn't easy, but Emily gradually found her footing. She joined the art club, where she channeled her experiences into colorful creations that inspired her peers. One day, she came home with a certificate for winning a district-wide poster competition. The theme: Standing Together Against Bullying. "Look, Dad," she exclaimed, waving the certificate proudly. "My poster's going to be in every school in the district." Matthew grinned, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Em. You're making a difference, just like you wanted." Meanwhile, Safe Steps continued to grow. The program was adopted by schools in neighboring states, and Matthew found himself busier than ever, traveling to train educators and speak at events. He never missed an opportunity to share Emily's story, always emphasizing the importance of listening to children and addressing bullying early. But he never lost sight of his role as a father. Despite his hectic schedule, he made sure to be there for Emily, whether it was helping her with homework, cheering her on at art competitions, or simply sitting with her at bedtime, listening to her thoughts and fears. One evening, as Matthew tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at him with a serious expression. "Dad," she said, "do you think I'll ever stop being scared?" Matthew's heart ached at the question. He stroked her hair gently, his voice steady. "Being scared is okay, Em. It means you're human. But being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you keep going, even when you are." Emily nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Like you. Matthew smiled. Like us. We're a team, remember? The turning point came during an annual Safe Steps conference, where Matthew unveiled a new initiative, a scholarship fund for students who demonstrated leadership in anti-bullying efforts. The fund was named Emily's Light in honor of his daughter's courage and resilience. When Emily took the stage to present the first scholarship, her voice was clear and confident. When I was bullied, I thought I was alone, she began. But I learned that there are people who care, who want to help. My dad taught me that standing up for yourself and others is the bravest thing you can do. This scholarship is for all the kids who are making the world a kinder place. The audience erupted in applause, and Matthew watched with tears in his eyes as Emily stepped off the stage, her head held high. Years later, as Emily prepared to leave for college, Matthew and Sarah stood on the porch, watching her load the car with her belongings. She was heading to a prestigious art school, having earned a scholarship for her work in social activism and art therapy. "You sure you're ready for this?" Matthew teased, his voice tinged with emotion. Emily rolled her eyes playfully. "Dad, I've been ready for months. Besides, I learned from the best." Matthew pulled her into a tight hug. "You're going to do amazing things. Em, just remember, no matter where you go, you've got a whole team behind you." Emily smiled, her eyes misty. "I know. Love you, Dad." "Love you too, kiddo." As the car disappeared down the driveway, Matthew stood with Sarah, his arm around her shoulders. "You think we did enough?" he asked quietly. Sarah leaned into him, her voice steady. "We did more than enough. And now it's her turn to change the world." Matthew nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. The pain of the past had shaped them, but it hadn't defined them. They had turned their darkest moments into something meaningful, something lasting. And as he watched the sun set on their quiet street, he felt a quiet certainty. The future was brighter than ever. Together, they had built a legacy of hope, resilience, and love that would carry on for generations.